Disorganized play. It's disorganized play. I hope you will stay and game with me. It's disorganized play. I'm trying to stay out of your way. There's got to be a lot more rhymes that go with a, right? Like that seems like a failure on my part to not be able to come up with more. I mean, I'm not a musician, but I am an improviser, so you shouldn't have to go to the rhyming dictionary to weigh, stay, play. It's not an auspicious beginning, you guys. It's not an auspicious beginning. Hey, everyone, I'm Tom Lommel. I'm a little bit taller than this. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. I am back with you. Fuckwad has a whole list of things. Hey, may, nay, ray, say. I feel like I've failed you on a certain level here, people, and I I don't know exactly what to attribute that to, but I'm going to try to be better in the future. Okay? So I'm Tom Lommel. I am the creator of The Dungeon Bastard. I am Lady. Lady. That's definitely something this show needs more of because right now it's just me. And although I'm a friend to the ladies, I would like to maybe this could be a little more not just a white dude talking to a camera kind of show. So that's the deal. Welcome everyone to the chat. I appreciate you guys joining me each and every time, etc. Yeah, so it's a recap show. We're going to talk about what we did last night in my Adventurers League game, how it went, kind of what some of the implications of that session are on more of a meta level maybe than a plot level. I want to talk about battle map focus. What does that mean? Well, we're going to find out in a few minutes. I'm going to try to keep the recap fairly short, and then we'll have some time for Q&A, right? So if you guys want to, if there's something you want to discuss, if there's a problem that you're having in your game, if there's your problem you're having, you're prepping or structuring or dealing in your game, tee those things up, but kind of sit on them a little bit because sometimes I address questions as they come up, and today I don't really want to do that. I want to kind of keep that compartmentalized to our agenda as it is written. Okay, so I am feeling better. Thank you, Xenar Faith. My cold has finally, I think, turned the corner. Even this morning, I could feel it floating around in my ears. So I'm in one of the two situations. I'm either on the mend and everything's going to be great, or I've noticed sometimes when I get a cold, I have that trough where you start off with a runny nose and then you feel better for a couple days and then it goes into your chest and turns into a cough and you're miserable and you thought you had it beat and you actually don't. I think I'm actually pretty good. So yeah, thanks for asking. I appreciate that. I apologize for bailing out on you guys on Monday Night Dungeon Fight, but I was definitely sick that day. So all right, let's talk about a recap of the session. So, it's always a little tricky to pick up a session like we did last night because I was off the week before and somebody else DM'd, and you're always like, where does this fit in the timeline and what's happening? And I had told the group, we're basically going to pretend that last week happened differently, like at a different time, and you're going to pick up with your 6th level characters, bring your leveled version of your 7th level characters, and once you take a short or a long rest, I'll let you level up to those abilities and we'll kind of figure out how the chronology of that works. So just background for those of you who don't necessarily remember or didn't hear, I was out last week and somebody else, one of the other players, DM'd an expedition for the group so that they didn't miss out on XP in the game and all that kind of stuff. Very cool, awesome. I'm glad that he stepped in and took over that, and the players were able to have a game while I was gone. But it's a little bit of that how do we juggle the chronology of how do we retcon this so that the timeline makes sense? So I told them, we're going to pretend that session happened differently. We're just basically pick right up from where we were. Even though you say that, there's still the like the hey, how's everybody doing? Chit chat, da 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 da. It takes like an half an hour to kind of get everybody centered and back on the thing. And of course, we had the battle mat, and they put themselves on the battle mat, and that was it, exciting and interesting. But honestly, like we burned close to an hour, I think, before we actually got dice rolling, got into the thick of things, got the combat really rolling, etc. So they fought. Boy, I should have uploaded some of the photos that I took last night, but they fought. It was they fought 8 yak folk, 2 yak folk priestesses, and 2 earth elementals. Because if you look in the book, those priestesses can summon earth elementals, and they just are around for 10 minutes, and there's no concentration required, and it just is something that happens, right? Like they can dismiss them, but unless 10 minutes goes by or they die or the priestess dismisses them, they're there on the battlefield. So I was looking at this combat, I'm like, there's a lot of heavy hitters on the battlefield, right? The yak folk, they're hitting for 46 plus 4, and they got a plus 6 to hit. They're probably gonna hit a lot, right? So they were pretty tough. The priestesses, the spell selection lined up for those creatures, it's not combat focused, and that's fine. Like, I'm okay with not every creature having a full-on, geared up for battle priest type of array of spells. That being said, I'm a little surprised they did not have at least Dispel Magic. More importantly, I'm very surprised that they didn't have Spirit Guardians, since Spirit Guardians is, as widely acknowledged, the go-to clerical battle spell. Like, it's such an area control spell. It would have made things different, but it was interesting. All right, so what were the highlights of the combat? Now, like I said, there was a lot of concern on my part because we've got essentially 12 major combatants on the table, right? So 2 Earth Elementals, they got a lot of hit points and pretty high armor class, and they hit decently hard. The 8 Yak Folk Warriors, they'd already been dinged up. Like, half of them had already been dinged up by some fireballs and stuff from the previous part of the combat. But they hit hard when they hit. They don't have a lot of armor class. They have a decent amount of hit points, right? 60 hit points. You can survive a couple, you can survive a couple hits from a PC if you got 60 hit points and your PCs are 6th level. And then we had the 2 priestesses that were sort of the X factor, right? I opened up, they knew that the priestesses had cast a banishment spell on Jorgen, the frost giant. So the party normally could not take on this combat, but they had Jorgen the frost giant with him. He's got a ton of hit points. He's got his armor now, so he's got an AC of 21. He is literally a battle tank, and he hits with his great axe, even without it being magical, just a regular giant-sized great axe. He's doing 3d12 plus 6. So he is pounding, when he hits. Now, I have decided that he always goes last in the initiative roll, though, so that at least gives the party a chance to do some stuff, although it kind of ends up being that the party softens guys up or sees, oh, there's a threat on the battlefield. Jorgen, can you take care of this? And Jorgen kind of goes over and goes, walk, and take care of it. I would feel worse about that if they weren't fighting, they're about to, the next thing that we're going to do is tackle the Fire Giant Forge, and there's a mess of guys there that have 160 hit points, right? So for Jorgen to go around and swing and do 50 hit points to a dude, it matters when there's only, when the dude only has 70 hit points and the party can soften him up for 25 first. It doesn't matter when the guy has 160 hit points and Jorgen goes, whacks him for 50, and he's like, yeah, I can take 2 more rounds of that. Bring it on. So I think this fight would have been especially deadly for the party if Jorgen, the Frost Giant, was not traveling with them. That being said, I don't feel like they thought that, like, oh, we've been cheated out of our glory. We haven't paid our dues. Jorgen saved our skin, etc., etc., etc. Right? We did not have any character deaths. We had characters go down consistently. Right? The bard went down at least 3 times. The fighter went down twice for sure. The sorcerer almost got schwacked. So those were the 3 characters that were in major danger. I think the monk did not go down, but the bard bard got in a lot of trouble. The bard got in a lot of trouble. So, hey everybody, I want to again just welcome everybody to the chat. Thanks for tuning in. I really do appreciate it. So, highlights of the combat. I started off right off the bat with the other priest. I considered having the other priest cast Bestow Curse on Jorgen the Frost Giant and then give him disadvantage on his charisma save to avoid a banishment in the next round. But Bestow Curse is a touch spell, and I didn't want that priestess to it was going to take too long. She was sort of back off of the main combat. She would have had to probably double move to get in there, deliver that, and then I felt like the party was going to dogpile on her right away. And I didn't want her to get burned out. So she did cast another banishment spell and just try to get Jorgen, zapped out, but that did not. He made a save. He made a save versus banishment. Now this combat goes a completely different way if either of the 2 banishment spells that she had dropped had actually fired on Jorgen and taken the Frost Giant out. Because then they either have to take those priestesses out and they drop concentration, or they're going to get massacred, right? So that's important. That was an important balancing factor. Now, keep in mind, Jorgen / Harshnag has legendary resistance, so it was a bit of a hollow threat. But the players don't know that, and I make all of my die rolls in the open in front of them. They see whether I hit, they see whether NPC or a monster saves, they see how much damage they do. I roll all that stuff in front of the screen, and I like since I started playing 5e, normally I was old school, right? I was old school. I roll everything behind the screen, and they didn't know, and it gives you a little room to fudge and stuff like that, right? But what it really started is when I started playtesting 5e, I decided I don't want the players to think that I'm manipulating the scenario somehow while we're playtesting. I want to actually playtest the material as written with the numbers as written. So I'm going to do all my die rolls in the open so that they know I'm being as honest with them, and I'm not making a monster intentionally harder because I think it's a better story. The monster is what the monster is. And so it started when I was playtesting, and I've just always continued that now as a habit, and I really find it kind of refreshing. There are a few roles that I will do behind the screen, right? When the players shouldn't necessarily know the outcome of, say, whether that NPC believes their bluff or not, or is making a deception check or something like that, etc. Like those sorts of things. Very limited circumstance, but for the most part, I roll everything out front. So they know whether he's made his saving throw. They know just how hard that those yak folk can hit. So the bard got out front and got into trouble because he got cornered by a couple earth elementals, and they chewed him up and they knocked him down. And then they've got a life cleric in their party, and that's the only thing that saved their bacon is that guy keeps popping people up, right? So there's a lot of ebb and flow to the combat. So the priestess has made a big difference in 2 particular ways. Number one, there's the threat of their casting banishment, which is a double-edged sword in the following way. Number one, it is a spell that can take a major combatant just off the battlefield, period, right? I mean, your forces just went down by X%, 1 in 6 or 1 in whatever it is, right? And taking Jorgen off the battlefield is a huge deal. Number 2, it tells them this NPC, this monster over here, this spellcaster can cast 4th level spells. That means there's 3rd level spells, 2nd level spells, 1st level spells. So that was important. So the banishment did not work. That was all right because in the subsequent rounds, the priestesses followed up with, well, if I can't take the giant out, let's see how these other dudes fare, and started casting hold person on people. And that's where things got a little dicey. The sorcerer, the dragonborn sorcerer, got kind of cornered, but like revealed himself. He was running around invisible, cast some attack spells, revealed himself, and the priestess turned around and went, hold person, and he was paralyzed. And then she whistles for one of her buddies, and a Yakfolk warrior, like, unfortunately was 5 feet short of movement, couldn't pull his attacks off on her, right? So the both of them closed with the paralyzed dragonborn sorcerer, and the only thing that saved that guy from absolutely getting massacred by the Yakfolk warrior next to him, because if you're paralyzed, you're taking crits if you hit, right? So that's problematic. And the only thing that saved him is the shadow monk, who teleports all over the battlefield, went over, used a key point, and stunned the priestess and broke her concentration. Right? That's the only thing that saved that guy. High moment of drama. Okay? That was great. That would really, it really provided some suspense, and it really changed what needed to happen on the battlefield in terms of the player's tactics. That monk was going to go someplace else, but he saw this was about to happen, and he knew how much damage those yak folks were hitting for. He teleported across the field, had to make, had to be the cavalry to come in and save the bacon. So that was, those things were probably they were a nice way to mix up the strategy and tactics and provide some ebb and flow to the combat. The nice thing about the Yakfolk Warriors was they have such a low armor class that the players were hitting on a consistent basis. That made a big difference in the combat. So the players feel like, they're making headway. They keep chopping it, slowly chopping guys down. But if when the combat comes around to the monsters again, the monsters are hitting them for decent amounts of damage. So it really was a very tactical fight. It was suspenseful. It was dramatic. I can't think of any other significant highlights that I think that are important to convey to you. Probably I did one very dirty Dungeon Master move, which was the cleric decides, okay, well, I'll open up with Spirit Guardians if nobody else is going to cast it. I'll cast Spirit Guardians. So he casts Spirit Guardians. Great, that's fine. You can do that. They sent an Earth Elemental over there to tank on that guy and try and get him to drop. I could not hit this guy for whatever reason. Dice went cold. They can see it. I kept missing. That's fine. I mean, he's wearing like either splint or plate, and he has a shield. So he's a little kind of tank himself. He doesn't do a lot of damage output. He's the healing battery that I can't get to. But he casts Spirit Guardians, and then the next round he's got this pair of golden lions that they got as a reward for completing a quest line. And he's like, well, I'm going to use my 2 wondrous figurines and summon my pair of golden lions and have them go attack this Yakfolk warrior. And I'm like, great, that sounds great. Sends the guys over there, they make their attacks, they do a bunch of damage, he's pretty proud of himself that he's got these combat guys on the board. And we get to the end of that, and I go, okay, that's pretty cool. I need a wisdom save for each of those lions. Oh, what? A wisdom save? What's going on? Well, they weren't on the map when you designated who all your allies were in your Spirit Guardians. I guess they're taking damage, aren't they? So they were like, oh, you got me there. That was I mean, by the rules, that was 100% fair. That was perfectly fine. It was a little bit of, it cuts, your Spirit Guardians cut both ways, and they were not there when you did that. You might want to change your order of operations in the future. So that was pretty good. The other, I think, only real significant thing was that the bard was on the roof of one of the barns, and the bard got down to like 12 hit points or 11 hit points, And there was a Yak folk warrior who just kept shooting him with his bow, and his bow did 2d8, and he kept like he would get healed up for 11 hit points, and then he would take 13 and go back down and get healed up for 9 hit points, and then he would take 12 and go back down. So the bard rubberballed a little bit. That was fine. That was interesting. All right, so we get to the end of the combat. The fighter, the fighter rogue, but their main combat guy, the fighter and the bard were both unconscious. They had both gone down, but they had both stabilized. And so they're standing in the middle of the Yakfolk village, and I'm trying to get the party to give me an answer on what are you doing. Like I said, the combat's over. What do you all do now? And partly there was an issue where there's no. Oftentimes in a game, you'll have like one or two people who end up being kind of like the lead, and they sort of decide what the party's going to do, and everybody else kind of nods and follows along, and yeah, that sounds cool with me, and there's not much of a fun. This party is kind of all over the place. Some of them want to go search some of the buildings, some of them want to loot the bodies, some of them want to kind of pull some pranks on the two guys that are on the two guys that are unconscious. It's very like all over the map, like almost literally all over the map what they want to do. So I get them to kind of focus, well, we're all going to go into the tent. We're going to pull everybody into the tent, and we're going to kind of take stock of what's going on. So we're going to take stock of some of the treasure and whatnot. Okay, great. They get into the tent, and there's three slaves that are in the tent. And the slaves are slaves of the Yakfolk chief, and they are described as being nude so that they can't hide any weapons or anything on themselves. They're kept as nude slaves. That's an interesting situation to tackle just in terms of context for your players, and how you handle a situation like that can go awry. We can talk about that in Q&A if you guys want to talk about that. So they, at any rate, they wanted to kind of, there's a little bit of pranking going on between the various characters in the group. And the group, some of the guys wanted to pull something where the two guys who were stabilized but still unconscious, they were going to pull some sort of prank with them while they're out, right? And the two guys who were unconscious were like, you're not going to heal us up like 3 hit points that we can be awake and do stuff and help out and blah, blah, blah. And they're like, no, we'll just let you chill out. And we're going to take like a short rest or a long rest here, and everything's going to be fine, etc., etc., etc. Well, two things. Number one, I know that because they blew up the water wheel that runs the elevator that goes down into the Fire Giant Fortress, that somebody from the Fire Giant Fortress is coming up to investigate in the next 15 to 20 minutes. Right? So I know that's in my hip pocket. I know that's going to happen. But secondly, on a metagame level, I know what these guys doing to these guys who are unconscious is kind of crappy. Right? It's not fair to take advantage of the fact that someone's character is unconscious, right? Particularly in an Adventurers League game. If it was a home game and everybody's cool with it and it's a part of a joshing thing, like, that's your game. You guys, like, mutually decide that level of activity is acceptable. Great, all right? But in an Adventurers League game, that's not cool. So I got everybody kind of like, what are you doing? Where exactly are you? And then I said, you hear someone outside yell, Kriatha Krata. And they're like, what does that mean? And I'm like, you don't know. That doesn't mean anything. It's not a word. It's not a phrase. It's not a language that you recognize because it's the chief's name, right? If someone yelled Siegfried and you didn't know that was a name, you wouldn't know what that means. So I'm like, you hear this get yelled a couple times. What are you going to do? And now they're starting to think, oh, well, maybe we should have woken those guys up. All right, lesson learned. Like, that's what I wanted to teach you. Is like, not only is it like uncool to dick around with these other guys, but you might actually need them. You're not in a safe place. So then one of the monk was like, I think I'm going to go over to the door, and I'm like, you know what, why don't we just roll for initiative? And that was another technique that I used to get everybody in line and realize, okay, the stakes are being raised. I'm going to make you roll for initiative because something dangerous is about to happen, right? So that's something to keep in your back pocket. Like, you can call for a roll for initiative whether combat's actually starting or not. It's a metagame tool that you can use to train your players' attention on what's happening and force them into, you get to act. You don't get to act because you rolled low. You get to act first. You get to act first. Now, it can backfire on you, but my point is, it's something that you, as a DM, that you can call for regardless of whether it's actually needed or not. It's a tool that you can use to pull the game table into focus and into attention on what's happening. Whereas if I just said, they might be listening, but meanwhile there's like 4 side conversations going on, and they're trying to decide, oh, okay, well, since we're not in combat, I'm going to run over and I'm going to heal him quick, and it's like, I don't want any of those kind of weird, funky shenanigans where somehow you get to pull off 3 actions before the fire giant comes out and challenges the guy in front of the tent. So that was something to keep in mind, right? Like, that was a tool that I deployed to get their attention, and also to heighten the lesson that leaving those 2 guys unconscious might have been a funny idea, but it wasn't necessarily the best strategic idea. Fire giant comes out, and the monk comes out and says, yeah, where is Chief Kriakartho? We're looking for him too. We're supposed to meet him here. And the fire giant is like, yeah, that doesn't seem right. Pay the toll or pay the price. And I didn't know what that meant when I said it, right? Pay the toll or pay the price. The fire giant comes out, pay the toll, pay the price. And really what I meant, it was just a moment of like, I'm going to threaten you and see what you're going to do about it. And of course, the player comes back with, what's the price? Well, so the interesting thing here is that the shadow monk is half elf, but he's half elf drow. So the fire giant looks at him and goes, you're a drow, you know what the price is. Slaves. Bring us some slaves. And I mean, this was a very dramatically effective moment for that character. And I want to focus on 2 things. Number 1, the reason it was so dramatically effective is because it was out and out racist, right? Like, oh, you're a drow, you're evil, you must deal in slaves. Now, without getting into a huge discussion of all of the connections and connotations and whatnot of deploying that type of technique in your game, because I want you to be careful with that, I will say that it's something that's been established in this game, and in specific, it's been established with this character. That he does not want to be seen as this evil drow. He doesn't want to be seen as being part of this, like, evil race of creatures that no one inherently trusts, right? So it was a very, like, I know that that's a lever that I can push with that player and that character. It's very effective, it's very dramatic, but I know that I can't overuse it, and I can't push it too far before it starts to become personally offensive, or at least feel like, a stab in a way that is beyond, that's on a higher context outside of the game world. Okay, but it was a very incisive moment, right? So then, then now that made the character mad. The player like bid on that, and that made the character mad, and he said something like, "Don't ever accuse me of being a slave." And then he started teleporting around or casting fairy fire or whatever, and combat broke out. And fortunately, wounded though they were, very dinged up though they were, Jorgen was able to still bear the brunt of the heavy lifting in the combat, and schwack schwack, they managed to take that fire giant down. They freed the elven slaves and finally got to kind of interrogate them, and one of them revealed, I'm a princess and I want to, return to the Moonwood, and please, if you will escort me, I would be grateful to you, although I have no riches or anything that I can bestow upon you. Now, at first, when they were like, we're some moon elves and we'd like to be escorted back to our tribe, everybody's like, no way, we got to get into this fire giant forge. We've got things to take care of. We got to get this axe. We got to kill this guy. Da, 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 da. And then she said she was a princess, and everybody was like, "Yeah, we should help her out. Let's go. Let's go. Let's go." So that's what they decided to do. So they decided to take up the side quest of escort them back. I said, the sun's setting. They took a short rest. I said the sun's setting. By the time you get to the base of the mountain, it's going to be dark. Do you want to travel a couple hours in the dark and then make a camp for the night and then move on during the day? Or do you want to travel like kind of through the night even though you're pretty worn out? Well, again, there's no real party leader. Things are kind of mixed. Let's take a rest. I'm out of spells. I don't have a lot of resources. I need a long rest to recharge, And then the counter argument was, if we get cornered by the fire giants, they're going to whack us. We're not going to have spells anywhere, so let's put put as much distance behind us as we can, etc., etc., etc. So they decided to push on. I rolled some random encounters. So I rolled one random encounter for each hour that they traveled. I only came up with 2 during the course of the 8 hours that they traveled overnight. So I rolled for a couple of those random encounters. One of them was a group of 10 Uthgardt barbarians who were, having some sort of ceremony around a campfire. They decided, you know what, this isn't the same group that we had encountered before. Let's just skirt around those guys. Fine, no problem, you can do that. I just hand-waved that encounter. The other one was a group of elk. They're traveling with this, this moon elf princess and her 2 cohorts. And there's an elk encounter in the book, and when you roll for the number of elk, and then there's a 1% chance per number of elk that one of the elk will have these shining golden horns, which I think is a really neat, like, little flourish of description, right? It really makes this thing, it makes that encounter pop a little bit. Well, sure enough, the dice came up, and I'm like, the shadow monk is out ahead of the group about 60 feet, and he makes his perception check, and he sees these 4 elk kind of wandering through the snow, and then one of them lifts its head, and you see this enormous golden rack of horns on the top of his head, and I'm like, what do you do? And he's like, I draw my bow and I shoot at it. And I'm like, okay. Sure enough, he hit it. I'm like, you wound it, but it's not down. You have enough movement with your shadow step and whatnot that you could, like, they start charging off, but you can chase them. You can get 2 more shots off if you choose. But you're going to start finding yourself pulling away from the party if you kind of bamf your way across the forest to chase after these things. And he's like, I really want to knock this thing down, but I'm not. No, you know what? I'm gonna stick to the party. I'm like, okay, well, are you gonna? All right, so you're gonna go back and report into the party? He's like, yeah, I go back. I start talking to Ren, and he's like, hey, I saw these 4 elk, and I'm like, yeah, this one had this rack of golden horns, and 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 Ren goes, "Oh, cool! Did you get it?" He's like, "Ah, I hit it, but I didn't knock it down." And, and at this point, the moon elf princess Halani hears this and goes, "Oh, it's the blessed elk of the moonwood. It is said that its appearance brings favor to those who." Wait a minute, you shot it? Yeah. So that was interesting. That was an interesting, nice moment of, it's a moment where you have something that in the game could just ostensibly be a normal encounter, right? It could be. It just happens that this elk is somehow imbued with gold, right? But why not make it a little more mysterious and a little more meaningful? It's a way to bring mystery into the world with really no downside, right? I don't have to think through what are all the metagame implications and is this balanced anymore and is this going to somehow affect, how powerful they. None of that stuff. Like, it allows me to bring magic into the world and make what I'm describing a little more fantastical and a little more compelling without having to worry about game effects, mechanics, any of that kind of stuff. So it was really like a great moment like that. Finally, and this is kind of where the recap ends. They got to this. The sun comes up, and Princess Halani says, "I know where there's this waterfall nearby that we can make camp and take a more of a rest and really recover ourselves, etc., etc., etc." And so they do that, and she meditates by the side of the pool, and it's very peaceful. And then suddenly, at the end of their long rest, after about 8 hours, 6 elven scouts show up and are like, your Highness, we're here to bring you back to the tribe. And the dwarven fighter was sort of like, well, don't you want to take your 6 scouts and come back and get vengeance against the people who imprisoned you? Like, we're gonna go fight these fire giants. And she's like, no, I very clearly want to go back to my tribe. Like, I've been imprisoned for months. I need to check in with my people, and I want to get my bearings. And plus there's only 6. There's 6 of them. That we're not a full fighting force. We're not prepared to take on a group of fire giants. He's like, oh well, I guess you don't care. Da 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 da. And he kind of made this like rude move. He had given one of the elven slaves his cloak, to really like to keep her warm, and he was sort of like gussying up to her and stuff. And he's like, "Well, I'll just take my cloak back." And she's like, "Well, I guess the mountain peaks aren't the only thing that's cold here in the forest." And he was sort of grumpy about that, and the bard instantly stepped up and kind of took the bait at that point and was like, "You can have this cloak here, allow me." And then it got into this thing with this nice little role-playing moment where she was like, "Ah, well, finally a man of, a gentleman of respect and decorum who cares about those less fortunate than him, and the moonwood shall sing of the brave deeds of the bard, the little boy bard. The bard's only 14. The little boy bard who showed so much bravery and brought his craven band of ruffians and despicable, unrefined warriors to bear against the evil Yakfolk village." So it was a really nice, like counterpoint of, okay, if you're going to be crude, then he gets a chance to shine by stepping up and being the distinguished gentleman and whatnot. So overall, it was a good session. It was a lot of fun. The combat went well. The combat was dramatic. It was high stakes. It was tense. They felt victorious. They looted the crap out of that village. They walked out with a gajillion gold pieces and a couple minor magic items, and then this flame tongue longsword or great sword that they can't decide what to do with because nobody's a heavy weapon fighter in the party. Overall, it was a very, very good session. But I will say, it consumed the entire night. By the time we were done with all of that role playing and whatnot, the whole 3.5 hours was burnt up on this combat with the Yak Folk village, and then the implications of coming out of that, like rescuing the slaves and doing the side mission. Okay, so in terms of going forward, and I'll talk more about this on Tuesday, I'm concerned now about how much time we have left in this season of Adventurers League before we really have to wrap things up and kick off the new one. Because we're looking at kind of end of March, beginning of April for that season to kick off. So we're kind of at the point where we got about 2 months. We got 8 or 9 sessions. I'd have to look at the calendar to kind of like drop that in and figure out exactly how many sessions we have left. But I'm looking at where we're at in terms of the storyline, and I'm getting concerned that this was a fun, big set-piece combat that everyone really enjoyed, but I'm going to have to start doing some selective editing. I'm going to have to do some pruning and streamline the storyline, bring it into focus so that we actually have, the meta plot get fully revealed, come into its glory, and then they're able to step in and be the heroes in whatever way, shape, or form that manifests itself. So that's where I'm at with that. It was fun, and it was good, and it was a good session. Now we need to start, like, with that in mind, how much time it took. We need to start thinking about pacing. The other thing that's complicated, and I'm going to talk about this on Tuesday too, is the Fire Giants sent somebody up. They massacred that guy. Nobody came back to report in what's wrong with the elevator. So the Fire Giants know something's screwed up. At some point, they're going to send somebody up there and go, oh, well, somebody came in and massacred the Yak Folk village. Somebody, we've lost a line of defense. We're going to have to either reinforce this area, fix this elevator, etc., etc., etc. Like, how on guard, how alert is the Fire Giant Fortress at this point? It says in the book, once he goes up to investigate, if he doesn't come back or he comes back and sees them, like Duke Zalto tells, puts the complex on high alert, we can't be surprised. Now, there's a couple opportunities. Number one, they went off and did this expedition. So I said, you know what, at the end of this scene where you part ways with the princess and she goes back to her tribe, let's think about those events that you did in Cloud Giant's Bargain. Let's have that slot in there so some time has elapsed. Now, if that's the case, we can slop some travel time in there to make things kind of like, to expand the timeline a little bit. So maybe they come back, instead of going right back to the Fire Giant Fortress the next day, maybe it's a week or it's 2 weeks, which maybe gives them a little more time to have some slack. There's some other thing. There's one other thing that I want to talk about here very briefly, which is we've got 4 out of our 6 players are pretty hack and slash, right? And we got 1 player who's kind of ride along and likes to do some goofy role playing moments and is engaged in the game. Not necessarily a hack and slasher, but like is just really looking for kind of like little weird moments to like find creatures to interact with and like find new foodstuffs to sample and stuff like that. Like he's playing a gnome, but he's really more of like a halfling style character, right? The other character or the other player at the table is really more of a role playing type of person. He's the guy who will come in and try and negotiate with people and try to like work some deception magic or kind of scam them, persuade them, etc. Like offer them a bargain. He's not going to just like rip open pull out his wand and start nuking things or whatever it is. He's definitely like, let's parlay a little bit and see if I can get some advantage into the situation before we start ripping stuff apart. So that's what I would like to do in the future, is find a way to offer him more opportunities to be successful, because this Yak Folk Village thing could have been an opportunity for him to shine, but he rolled badly in initiative, and the people ahead of him just decided to start straight up attacking a dude who hadn't really, this Yak Folk walked out of a building and like looked at them like, who are you? And he's like, I'll tell you who we are, Whereas if the Bard had been higher up in the initiative, the Bard probably would have fabricated some sort of story and kind of felt them out. Like, can we negotiate with you? What are you guys really up to? Are you friends, enemies, etc.? So that's something to consider when you're looking at the play styles around the table. It's something that I want to make sure that when I start turning the spotlight around, I give some moments for that guy, like more of a opening. I think there may be an opening where the party could potentially pose as like a slaver and some slaves, because that's already been suggested to them by this fire giant, right? So I might reinforce that idea offline and see if they go for it, or I might just like float them in our little private Facebook group saying, what is your next strategy? Let's assume that 10 days have transpired between leaving the Yak Folk village. Let's assume 10 days have transpired before you come back to that village. How would you like to approach this situation? Or do you want to approach it with deception? Do you want to approach it with stealth? Do you want to try and outright find a different back door? Or what do you want to do? So, all right. I don't know how our recap ended up taking 45 minutes, but that's the way it worked out. I hope you got some useful tips and insight out of that. There's something else that I want to show you here, and it is, I'll put that away. So I want to talk for a moment about battle map focus. So this is the battle map that we drew full scale on Tuesday. If you tuned in for the marathon 3-hour episode of Disorganized Play on Tuesday, we drew this whole thing, right? And in fact, I'm sorry, needs to be down a little bit so I can show the whole thing. There we go. That's pretty good. Great. So this is our full-scale gaming paper battle map that I rolled out on the table and that we used last night. Now, it's useful to have all of these buildings represented, right? It was useful to have those things. They got a feeling of the entire locale. They definitely like knew the dimensions, they knew where the buildings were. They had an accurate representation of what this particular portion of the village was. Just one quick, I'm always bad at this. Let me use this finger. So these double doors that are up here, we had this thing on the table. It's 30 by 30 inches, and it's taking up most of the table that we're playing at. And one of the guys had his notebook on top of those double doors, and most of the group missed those. So that when the fire giant comes out of those doors, they were like, oh, maybe we should have looked around and saw what that was all about. And a lot of it was just because the guy had his character sheet on top of those double doors. So, in terms of depicting the village, this did a great job. And I'm very happy with the battle map. It served its purpose well, and it was definitely worth the time that I put into it. But I will tell you that the majority of where we played was in front of this gate right here, and then I can't really do a pointer, but between the main gate and the main hut. So from the center of the map over this way, it was just that cluster, just that quadrant, right? That's where the majority of the combat took place. There was a little bit off into the back, like over on this area, kind of between the 3 barns in the lower left-hand corner, like between the center barn and those 2 barns in the lower left. Like, that's where the sorcerer got cornered. But that's it. Okay, that's the mostly. I guess what I'm getting at is we used about half the map for the battle, and a big portion of that battle was clustered right in probably a 30-foot by 30-foot area. So when you're putting something together like this, I want you to consider there was a gap, there was a choke point that they were going to rush into, and then there was a choke point created by this semicircle of Yak folk warriors who were waiting inside, just inside the village. And the rest of the map wasn't really utilized. Now, I could make the rest of the map more interesting if, for instance, I did something like, I'm going to put some barrels back in the corner of the map, or there's some sort of tower, or there's a cache of weapons, or there's a pen of wild boars that you could let loose, or so my point is your map is going to kind of like focus around one particular this map, not necessarily every map, but this map got very focused around a very small portion of the entire map, right? The combat got focused in a very specific area, and most of the party did not, and most of the NPCs did not stray out of that area, with the exception of like about 4 out of the 17 people fighting, right? I could encourage that combat to get more spread out by putting NPCs behind buildings and having them shoot from cover. It's not optimal tactics for Yak folk. I could encourage players to go different places on the map by giving them features to interact with. But in this particular case, everything's basically just a building that's in your way. It has no other tactical significance. And if you want to put all the time and energy into something like this, you might consider getting a little more juice out of the whole thing by giving them a few knobs to fiddle with, by making the terrain a little more interesting and a little more dynamic, and giving it some strategic knobs to twiddle, so to speak, right? I'm not unhappy with what it was there for, what it used for. It fulfilled its basic function. So on Tuesday we talked about what's the basic function of a battle map. Where can I stand? How far is it to give me a range? How far is it from me to any other point on the map? Is there something interesting for me to interact with? Is there something that's an obstacle that's in my way that I have to go around? And is there something that is a potential danger to me, like Christian points out, like a fire pit or a trap, or an area of difficult terrain? There's a big patch of ice, or there's a pit filled with acid, or there's just a stream. How deep is that stream? That sort of thing. So that's something to keep in mind, is the battle got focused in one particular area, and I don't think I wrung as much opportunity out of using a tactical grid going right onto the tabletop as I potentially could have. That's not good or bad. I don't feel disappointed by how the combat played out. It was a very exciting, suspenseful combat. But there were some opportunities for me as the DM to add some elements that would have encouraged more creative tactics, right? So that is our battle map focus. I will, for like 5 or 10 minutes here, if you guys have questions, take questions in terms of if you have a question about what's going on in my game, you have a question or a problem with your game, you just have something that you want, something gaming related that you want to pick my brain about, I'm willing to entertain those things now. So, Xenar Faith is spitballing on this idea. Could snow or dust or hail be used to move them indoors for cover? Does it change it too much? It would be interesting to do something like there is acid rain falling across the battlefield, or we summon a cloud kill, and this area is now is now a lethal area to move through, but you might be safe if you were to get underneath this or whatever. It was interesting. I don't want to sell myself too short because there was a lot of, I'm going to climb on top of this barn. I'm going to teleport up next to this chimney. Is there enough? You know, when I talked about this thing the other day, I kind of poo-pooed the fact that I had drawn all of these, you know, these little shadow indications on the map. And it turns out that with the Shadow Monk's ability, he has to teleport into an area that's not well lit, right? Well, I said this is taking place toward the end of the day, but it's not nighttime. So I could look at what was depicted on the side of the building and go, you could teleport over to this hex, but this hex is actually well lit, and you can't teleport, you know, to the other side of that building, etc. And because it was on the map, it's an additional selling point for the player. It's not the player's like, oh, well, it sounds like he's kind of trying to screw me out of my ability and not let me use it to the fullest extent. Because it's actually depicted on the map, I go, you now understand kind of generally where you can go. So that was actually useful to have provided that sort of to have provided that sort of detail and actually have it pay off in in the actual outcome of the game and during the actual running of the game. So it definitely takes more prep time. I'm going to be a little nitpicky and say I don't know that it speeds up play, but it clarifies play, right? When you go into the tabletop, it definitely gets a little more finicky and like, oh no, I can't. Like if I've been doing Theater of the Mind, it's about a move. You can go about 30 feet. I can't tell you how many times I end up going, well, that creature's got to do a double move because he's 5 feet short or he's 10 feet short. Whereas if we were doing Theater of the Mind, I'd be like, yeah, it's about a standard move. You know, when you do Theater of the Mind, everything starts to shorten up into those increments. That's what you have to be careful of, right? Is everything shortens up into, yeah, it's about 30 feet away. Whereas when you get on the actual tabletop, you know, and all of a sudden some inefficiencies are introduced, which I think you know it on the one hand, you can go, well, it slows the game down. Just get the players to that thing, you know, to let them take their action or whatever. But the other part of it is it creates situations where it dials up the realism just a little bit. Or in this particular case, it actually saved the bacon of the player who was in trouble, right? So the Dragonborn Sorcerer pops out of invisibility and goes, I'm in this hex right here. And the priestess turns around, casts Hold Person on him. And she whistles for her Yak Folk warrior buddy, go kill that guy. Now, if we're in Theater of the Mind, I go, yeah, he's about a standard move away. He moves over to you, hits you twice, crits you both times. He normally does 44 or 46 plus 4. Because it's a crit, he's doing 8d6 plus 4, and he does that twice. So you're taking 16 die 6 worth of damage. Like, that guy's like, he's mopped at that point, right? But because we were playing on the battle map, we counted it out, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. He doesn't have reach. He's got to close that extra 5 feet. That's his double move. It spared the character, but it also provided drama. Because everybody knows that next round, that character is going to get just la machined. There's an old reference for you. Like the Ginsu knives are coming out and are going to chop him down to pieces. That then motivated the monk to burn up all of his movement to get over there, stun the priestess, and release the guy from the spell effect. So that's, yeah, there's pluses to it and there's minuses to it. You know, if you follow Sly Flourish on Twitter, he's not necessarily a huge fan, but I'm a big fan of bringing them in for set piece, real like highlight showcase combats, and then hand waving it for other stuff. And the elk, I don't know how far it is away. You've got enough movement because you're a monk that you could run 40 feet, use a standard move 40 feet, shadow teleport another 60 feet. Yeah, you can keep up with this thing, no problem, and still take a shot at it. I can hand wave that kind of stuff. So I think it's important. It's an important tool to vary the pacing of your game. And as we talked about in previous installments, not only do you want to vary the pacing of your mix of role-playing encounters and combat encounters and negotiation and exploration and all of those elements, and maybe you want to have a travel montage, or maybe you want a nitty-gritty data, like deciding whether you want to go battle mat on the grid, very detailed, lots of dynamic environmental effects that you can jump back and forth, interact with, and consider and use and move and be very strategic, or you want to have a freewheeling, like let's do this theater of the mind, narratively cinematic, slash, swoosh, bam. I think all of those tools are valuable. You need to be able to read your group, but you also need to be able to know, I'm not going to rely on one so that it becomes very monotonous in terms of the pacing is the same over and over and over and over, repetitive. I mean, and also you got to keep in mind what the effect of bringing that battle mat out. I cannot tell you the number of times where the players thought they were in the middle of something sort of casual, and then I go, let's clear the table, and everybody goes, oh, okay, we're about to have, like, this is our major combat thing. We're clearing the table, we're setting up miniatures, etc. So use it for a way to use it as a means to pace and give your game some nice variety of rhythm, and a variety, not just rhythm, but also of play experience, of encounter type. All right, so yes, as Christian points out, sometimes you need to be in bullet time, sometimes you do not. So, Seldom I bet that has only happened 8 million times. Seldon Arcanus says, I'm going to try to DM a game on Roll20 for my channel, but I don't know whether to do Dungeon World or Roll for Shoes. I would do 5th edition, but I'm not experienced enough to DM it yet. Okay, so I do want to ask a follow-up question here, which is, what do you mean by you're not experienced enough to DM it? Do you feel like you don't have a good enough handle of the rules, but you've played other games, or you've never really led a game, and so you're not sure, about coordinating everyone's movements and interpreting their actions and adjudicating, like, everything that happens at the table? Like, when you say you're not experienced enough to DM 5th edition yet, is it related to your understanding of 5th edition, or is it related to your experience running a game? That's something I would follow, like, that's my follow-up question for you. I would say kind of my answer depends upon whether you have DM'd other styles of game. I've never DM'd and had minimal playtime with 5th edition. You're going to do this on Roll20, right? You would do 5e, you're not experienced enough to DM it yet. I mean, you've got actual plays of all of these things to follow, right? I think part of it depends upon what sort of experience your group is looking for. Are they also all new to role-playing? Do you want to do something that's a little goofy and fun? What I like about Dungeon World is that it is very easy for most people to pick it up and know that I have these 3 things that my character can do, and that's what I'm good at. But I think it can be a challenge for the DM to constantly be coming up with new moves when they you know, when they roll a 6 or lower, or there's a result that comes at a cost. So that's tricky in terms of, I think it's going to put more of a challenge on you as a DM, although I really, you know, I love that system. If you want something a little more freewheeling and goofy, you know, obviously go for Roll for Shoes. You might, I don't know. This is a very difficult question for me to answer because you're really getting at getting at the heart of what is the best introductory experience for a GM, right? And I don't know that there's a great. I don't know that there's a great intro experience for D&D for somebody who's new to the game, right? So to me, the big pitfall of D&D style role-playing games is, you know, like when it first came out, D&D was so complicated that the only way to learn it was to play it with somebody who already knew how to play it, right? There's countless stories of people sitting down with the books and be completely confused by what's going on because it's so dense and there's so many, you know, interlocking elements. And I think the new, you know, D&D starter set, and I think, you know, for instance, the Pathfinder beginner box or whatever, do a great job of introducing people to the concepts and getting them. But it's still they still have all of those moving parts, right? And I think there needs to be like a simpler version that um, that obscures some of that. Some of it comes down to like, have they played video game RPGs that have this sort of system, etc., right? So I'm tempted to tell you take some NPCs or take some pre-generated characters from 5e, take them like second level, just take the pre-gens off the website, and then build a very basic, very small adventure for them, and make sure that it has. So I did an intro like when 5e first came out. I wrote my own intro adventure, and I'm regretting that I haven't published it because to me there's a certain set of adventure elements that kind of boil down the core essence of what a dungeon crawl experience is like, right? And so in one room there was they were tasked with investigating this crypt and to returning this amulet to the crypt where this noble had been buried centuries ago. And there was a room where the crypt had been part of the crypt. One of the chambers had been defiled, but there was this casket, and there was a spirit that appeared and spoke to them, but it was limited to that room, and it didn't ever leave that room. And you could kind of interact with that guy, but you could never get him to help you, right? That was one thing that happened. And then there was a supernatural encounter, let's put it that way. There was another part of the crypt that was like this maze of traps, and so there was that whole like, I need to figure out like, how are we going to get through this area where gravity goes, you know, upside down for 10 feet or whatever. So that was cool. Is it like run the gauntlet of traps. And then there was kind of like a riddle room where the riddle, or at least the puzzle to the room, was there was a bunch of statues, and by fiddling around and investigating the statues, you could figure out there was actually a secret door here, and you could figure out either a way to trigger the secret door, or you could kind of basically like pick the lock on it and have it open up, right? And so that was cool. And then we got into the next room. One room was flooded. That was just sort of setting the stage for what was going on in the final room. The final room, you enter the crypt, and the crypt is flooded with water up to like your knees, and these skeletons rise up out of the water and attack you because the crypt has been defiled, etc., 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 right? My point being is I had 4 different types of encounters that I boiled down to the quintessential elements of an exciting dungeon crawl. I knew how they all related together. I didn't make any one of them too difficult, and that was it. It was those 4 encounters, and it played really well in about 3 or 4 hours. So you could write your own. There's a ton of material on like on the DM's Guild, or I'm sure Roll20 has got elements and things like that. So I guess I'm inclined to tell you, don't get something like pre-published that's enormous. If you're going to dip your toes into the wild and woolly world of DMing, and I highly encourage you to do so, but you're not 100% confident, that's fine. Get something small that you can get your mind around, you understand well, and you can see possibilities in. Okay? Just think of it like the example of the golden elk that appeared in the session last night. By the book, it could have just been a golden elk. But I saw a possibility there that it was the sacred elk of the wood, and now it's become something that I can touch upon and that has some meaning in the world greater than it's worth 250 gold pieces if you kill it. So find something small, self-contained. It really comes down to, do your players have that experience? How much experience do they have as well? So I'll try and talk about this more next week, but let me think about that. I love Dungeon World, don't get me wrong, and Roll for Shoes is fun. I think for common experience and like your ability to like quickly Google things and go, oh, how does this rule work or whatever, 5e has a larger footprint right now. And Dungeon World assumes that you have a certain level of expertise and comfort with improvising. If you do, then Dungeon World can be great. It's very simple, very straightforward. I love running that system. You also might consider like Fate Accelerated. That has a very interpretive system attached to it. It's very easy to learn and run and adjudicate and get up and rolling. In terms of starter games, those are things that I would consider. There's other options out there, and I'm struggling for 2 reasons. Number one, I wish I had the best answer for you right now, and I don't. And the number 2 part of that is I'm not entirely happy with the introductory experience of most RPGs, because from a pure basic beginner level, I don't think they do a good job of teaching you the game experience. It gets too convoluted and complicated into resolution mechanics and things like that. This is actually something that I spend a lot of time thinking about, and a lot of time coming up with alternative mechanics and my own kind of spin on things. So that's why I'm mumbling my way through this answer. So yeah, I agree that Castle Caldwell might be something to look at. It's not a good adventure, I agree, in that it's very compartmentalized, but sometimes that's what you want, right? You want to be able to pick and choose which pieces of it you actually have time to do. I will say, if you have more than 4 encounters, you're over planning. Whenever I look at a map that has 18 different rooms and they all connect in these weird funky ways and stuff like that, I'm like, that's great for a month's worth of playing. But to do a one-shot and kind of get your feet wet and have some fun and see how it goes, you don't need to plan, whether it's face-to-face or online, you don't really need to plan more than 4 encounters. A combat encounter, a trap, some sort of role-playing encounter, and some sort of like exploration, puzzle, maneuver, whatever we do, and reveal something, discover something. Like those 4 basics. And if you want to have 2 combat encounters, great. However you want to do it. But that's something to think about, is like how you're going to be surprised very quickly how little you have to put forward for the players to spin around and do a bunch of stuff, and you're starting to answer questions and explain things, and they're going to screw around with this, and then combat breaks out, and combat takes 45 minutes, or combat takes an hour. Like, D&D combat takes time. That's the way that the game works. Other game systems, resolve things relatively fast. D&D can go fast, but oftentimes, especially at low levels, it can go a little slow because you're missing a lot, and then you hit the guy for 3 hit points, and he's still got 6 left, and then you may miss for 2 more rounds, and you hit, and then you may miss for 2 more rounds. So favor being prepared, like having 4 solid, really well-prepared encounters versus having 8 kind of half-assed loosey-goosey type of things. So, yeah. So, don't get attached to your story. I don't know. You know what? Like, I agree with James V. Like, stick to frameworks. So, be attached to your story, but don't be attached on the way that your story plays out. Don't be afraid to kill your major villains, etc. Like, we could have a whole long discussion about campaign planning. But we are out of time, everybody. So thank you so much for joining me. I will be back on Tuesday at 2 o'clock, where we're going to prep session 16 and see how these jokers take on the Forge of the Fire Giants here, Iron Slag, as it were. Let's take a quick look at our Let's take a quick look at our calendar. So tonight, no, last night was Misadventures. Tonight. Well, you can go off and watch Bearded Men West do improvised D&D at 4:30 today, in 1 hour from now. I will not be there. I'm not. Timothy is DMing this week. I will be on next week with them. But that doesn't mean it's any less of an entertaining show, so you're welcome to do that. You get the rest of the evening on your own recognizance, as it were. Tomorrow night, it's Star Wars Edge of the Empire. Never Tell Me the Odds with your DM, Mr. David Crennan. Saturday, of course, we've got Masks, or Powered by the Apocalypse. There's a lot of licks coming in here. I'm not sure what's going on. I think maybe I'm tired and hungry. So, Masks, which is superheroes powered by the apocalypse. 5 o'clock is Phoenix Dawn Command. Sunday, you can catch my marathon rebroadcast on YouTube of making this boss Yak Village battle map, if you did not watch it. That was a good time, and it paid off. So I think hopefully you learned some good techniques for those of you who managed to sit through this thing. But oh well, Selden Arceus has their own stream at 6 p.m. tonight, also an option. So I want to thank you all for joining me. I'm pretty excited about what we got in the hopper here, and I'm glad to get back on my feet with the game. So thank you so much for tuning in. Until next time, let's a dungeon. Yes! Right on the first try.